Welcome to CEX Talks, the show where we dive deep into stories, strategies, and innovations which are shaping the future of the customer and employee experience. I'm your host, Abhi Jain, and today we have an incredible guest joining us, someone who's not only just helping build the future, but also empowering those bold enough to dream. Our guest is Andres Perez, co-founder and general partner at Carya Venture Partners, a venture capital firm that invests in cutting-edge startups at the earliest stages. Andres and his team back visionary founders in the field like AI, deep tech, and B2B SaaS. But Andres isn't just a VC. He's also an entrepreneur at heart. Before founding Carya, he co-founded Sanus, a groundbreaking voice AI company that's transforming global communications experience. Andres brings a unique perspective as both a founder and an investor. Today, we'll talk about his journey from entrepreneur to venture capitalist, his insights on building transformational startups, and his take on the future of AI and deep tech. Andres, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Abhi, thank you so much for having me. It's been great getting to work with you from the earliest days of Saunas to now, and just seeing how our world of CX and customer support has changed since we got to know each other around 5 years ago. So it seems like the space continues to move at breakneck speed, and happy to dive into and excited to dive into it with you.
No, great. So before we dive into the serious stuff, for our audience, what's one thing about you that most people won't guess?
That most people won't guess. That's very interesting. So I actually think how a good one. Sonus was, of course, very related to languages and to the way that people communicate, and a lot of what we do at Voice AI as well. But one of the things that people usually don't guess when they see my name is, or rather they do guess that my first language is Spanish. But actually my first language is Italian. And the reason being, my mother is Italian, so when she kind of taught me how to speak,
I think we talked about it in the first conversation, so yes.
yeah. And so, but the funny part about that was, we would speak Italian at home, and then my school was in Spanish, but then like everything I would read or watch on TV, my mom like essentially forced me to have it be in English, right? Now, of course, we were grateful for that. But what happened like during maybe the first 8 years of my life was I was incredibly confused because I couldn't distinguish like any, languages from another. And there's one very funny instance when we were being taught how to say hamburger in English at school.
Mm-hmm.
And I obviously don't remember this, but apparently I threw a crazy tantrum and got kicked out of class that day because I told the teacher that she was wrong and that it wasn't a hamburger, it was a Krabby Patty. And it was because I had learned English watching SpongeBob. So yeah, I don't know. I think languages have always been deep into my history and myself. So getting to work with Saunas on that side and the CX space holds a dear place in my heart for sure.
Yeah, and it's scary how SpongeBob is the cultural definition of English.
Our channels were very limited back home in Venezuela, so
Yeah.
I was definitely part of the lucky few to have SpongeBob. But hey, it got me to a good level in English, so I owe a lot to them.
Which is great. Which brings me to our question. Like, given you grew up with 3 languages, is that where the whole interest into voice AI communication began? So let's talk about that a bit. About Sanus, it's a fantastic company, gave birth to an idea, which is a category of its own now. So what was the moment, which sparked it? Okay, hey, yes, this is the problem statement that we should look at.
Yeah, no, for sure. And in doing so, I'll give you a little bit of like maybe my background and how we ended up there, specifically related to CX. So I grew up my whole life in Venezuela from, 99 till 2017. But there was a very interesting point there when I was 12 where we were trying to move to Panama because things in Venezuela weren't great. And in order to move to Panama, one of the one of the policies that they have is like, hey, if you want to move here and get a visa for your whole family, you can start a business here. And coincidentally, what the business that my father decided to start was actually a call center. So whenever we would go there, which would be like 3 months out of the year, I would, still be in school back home in Venezuela, but I would do like all my schoolwork at an agent desktop. So I kind of grew up a little bit around the CX space in that way. And when I came to the US for school, I met a few people in my life that definitely changed it. And a few of them, two of those were Max and Sean, who then became my co-founders at Sonos. And then the reason why the idea came along was because of a mutual friend that we have between the three of us named Raul. And Raul is originally from Nicaragua, but also spent a lot of time in Guatemala. And he is one of the smartest people we know. I mean, Stanford electrical engineer. He was an Olympic Muay Thai fighter, like just incredible person. Super happy, super joyous, incredibly intelligent as well. And at one point during his Stanford career, he went back home to go, help his family as things were kind of going on with like Nicaragua, Guatemala, and he wanted to find a job while he was there, specifically a job that paid well. And in specific regions of Central America, especially if you don't have a college degree, as he hadn't had one yet, call centers is one of the best paid jobs. And so when he called us and told us this, you're like, man, you're gonna end up running this call center in 6 months, right? Because he was just so amazing, so intelligent, so full of life. We had no doubt that he was going to rise above the ranks very quickly. But it was very surprising to us when after those 6 months, he basically told us and said he quit. And Raul, like if you've ever met him, this guy is not a quitter. Like, he's really, stubborn in his resilience, which is something that we look up to him a lot for. So it was very surprising to us to hear that. And the reason he said was actually because he was being mistreated because of his accent. And that to us was very strange because, or it was just weird that like that was actually going on in the 21st century, right? And that it would happen to someone so close to us, right? And I'm from Venezuela, Max is Russian, Sean is from China. We got, kind of accents galore within our friend group. So it was very weird for us for that to happen. So we were Stanford students at the time, and we just said, hey, like, let's maybe build something where you can match accents on a phone call and let's see what happens. And then the conversation kind of became more serious. And then we met Sharif, brought him on board. And that's really how the company grew. So that's I think like the earliest point in terms of why we started it.
And then that's a story, which is very close to, I think, everyone's heart, right? Especially in the contact center industry, especially if you're coming from a non-native English-speaking country,
right?
We all have faced it at some point or the other. There's always a bias that creeps in, and I think, using this technology, we are all, kind of removing that bias, which is a great mission to start any venture in.
Right.
But now, as you look at the future of voice and voice AI, you guys have created a category of your own, you're leading that category today, which is amazing. But overall voice as an ecosystem, continues to stay and then will continue to stay. You all know that. Okay.
Yeah.
Where do you think are the next innovations, which are happening in this space, in the next, say, 2, 3, 5 years?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's actually a very timely question too. A16 just released their kind of state of voice AI report, and they kind of broke things down into a few categories. But when you look at the main ones, of course, there's like vertical specific, categories. But in terms of when you look at it like horizontally, there's probably two main ones, and then there's one that I think a lot of folks have missed. So there's, voice generation. So that's all your TTS companies. So that's everything from an 11 Labs or Curvetesia, et cetera. And then there's speech understanding companies. I think, Whisper for OpenAI is there. Deepgram was, famously was, I think, one of the leaders and creators of that category, several years ago. And then you have everything that's kind of, you know, ancillary to that, right? So, for example, we're investors in a company called Retell. Something that Retell does greatly is, hey, how do you actually take, a speech generation product and make it such that humans can actually interact with it? So that means everything from, like, can you interrupt the agent? Can you, speak in different forms? Can you react the proper way, et cetera? So there's a lot of kind of infrastructure that has to be built there. And then I think there's a third one, which is where Sonus fits in pretty squarely, which is speech transformation, right? So when humans are speaking, right, what tools can you use to transform that speech? Sonus is, of course, an example. Another one is, anything to have to do with voice translation or real-time voice translation, of course, fits there. There's noise cancellation, et cetera. There's a lot of things that can be built there. And when you look at what needs to be built, I think where that we've definitely, I mean, look, when you look at it back from when we started Sonus in 2020, this space was, I mean, so nascent, right?
Correct.
Uh, to the fact that there was very little data sets available. There were very, very little tooling. A lot of it was done manually. I mean, some of the earliest memories that we have of like trying to compile data is having Max like, read scripts on a Dolby app and using that as our data set. So that said, there's still, for example, there's still a few issues when you look at voice. Like voice in itself is an optimization function, so you have to optimize based on constraints. And a lot of things you want to optimize is, latency, naturalness, inference efficiency. There, there's players now that each do one specific thing very well. I think the space is beginning to asymptote. I don't know if it asymptotes this year. I don't know if it asymptotes maybe in 3 years, but I do think there will be a point where, you can get latency down to a certain point and naturalness has gone up to the point where it's essentially indistinguishable. But that's still, that'll still take work.
So how
That'll still
close
take,
are we to having a seamless global communication? How close are we?
in terms of like, when you say global, do you mean like translation
Like,
or do you mean just,
yeah, people talking to each other, being
yeah.
in real
So
time, translation, clarity, and everything. So how close are we to that?
totally. I think clarity is pretty much there in terms of naturalness for generation, or very close at least. Um, Translation is a very fascinating problem. I'm an investor in a company called Toby, which is attacking this problem, and it's actually more of a grammatical issue than it is a technological issue, which is kind of fascinating. So when you look at, for example, call it Italian to French translation, right? Those are two languages that are very close to each other. So the grammatical structure of each sentence closely simulates, is closely related to one language to another. However, when you look at languages that come from different roots, for example, if you look at like Spanish and Japanese, right? The structure of the sentence is completely different, right? So even if you had like zero latency, ASRs and zero latency TTS and a zero latency like LLM to actually do the translation, you still have to wait for context windows, right? So a lot of people, would ask us is like, hey, when voice translation comes around, like, won't that make Sonus obsolete? And it's like, there's certain use cases where for sure you'd rather just speak in your regular in your mother tongue, right? But when latency comes around and naturalness comes around, at that point you want to do phonetic translation rather than
Mm.
proper
Yeah.
sentence and word translation. So it's a fascinating problem. Um, it is kind of the much harder version. Well, both I think are equally hard because the constraints on accents or accent translation is a lot more strict. But voice translation is getting there. I just think there will always be a big latency and big context windows needed for certain translations between one language to another. So
Okay.
we're getting there. Well, the Star Trek translator will become reality at some point soon.
Yeah. Okay. No, I'm looking forward to that. So as you talk about that, and is that the reason why suddenly having co-founded Sanus, you were technically very involved in it, and then moving on to leading Carya Ventures, Partners, taking an active role. So what was the point where you said, okay, I want to switch gears now, and I would rather become an investor? So
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think one of your roles as a founder is to hire yourself out of a role as quickly as you can. And with that said, at Sonos, I kind of wore a lot of hats, but it was mostly on operations and GTM, right? So it was basically, the what I told myself is I'm not smart enough to deal with the technical side of the problem. Let me handle, the rest of the stuff. And in doing so, one day we get an inbound message from someone named Sharath Keshavat. Sharath Keshavat was, at the time, he was, founder and CRO of Observe AI. So Observe, to us, they had started 3 or 4 years before we did. They had grown at that point to a unicorn valuation when we first got to know each other. And they were, in a way, a big role model, right? Both as a company, but also personally to us as founders. And so we got to know Sharath really well. I formed a great personal relationship with him. We started investing on a bunch of stuff together. And, when Sharath was thinking about his next step in order, after Observe, the conversations kind of took to, hey, why, don't you join us as co-founder, right? And this is at a time where, the company was starting to really take off. And I felt that, Sonos had been my only job. It's like I hadn't really had a job before. So when it comes to selling, speech products and at the time we were mostly focusing on BPOs, there's literally no one better to do so, but Jarth.
mhm.
So he came on board. They raised a big Series A, and kind of the company really started to transform itself into, a small startup to, we call it a movement, right? The Sonos movement in terms of what we're looking to do. And I just realized that I had reached my goal of hiring myself out of my job. And in doing so, I was very happy for Shar to take over that role because he had taught me everything I knew, and I don't think there was a way for me to do anything better than what he had taught me to do. And then we, brought on a amazing executive team, and what we saw at the time was, Series A was a big announcement. We started seeing a lot of companies come to us, be it on the voice AI space, on the infra space, or on the CX AI space, just wanting to kind of chat and like hear about, how did we get here? What did we learn, et cetera. But one specific thing happened that year, which is that ChatGPT was released. And so suddenly you had, we had this big influx of, startups coming in, but then we had a lot of our customers at the time asking like, hey, Sonos does speech transformation, right? What else are you guys seeing in the AI world that we should start adopting? So we kind of were the middleman between, these two parties. And we said, hey, I think the best thing that we can do is just start investing in these companies. And so we started doing that personally. And then, between us and our other partners, we built up Carya Fund One, late 2022. So it's a $10 million vehicle. And we got very lucky with a few of our investments. So we did, Crescendo, Martian, Retell, and these are kind of like the more CX and voice AI focused ones. But then we decided, hey, it seems like there's something real here. Let's double down. So that's when we raised Fund Two at the end of last year. And through all of this, I connected a lot with venture investing, and the beauty of it was like there was something new to build with the same people. And so that connection of being able to do something that, venture firms typically tend to last, a lot longer than companies because of the long, holding periods and just the nature of VC. So the idea of working with the same people forever and to build something that, can last beyond us, as Sonos will too, was extremely appealing. And so, yeah, that's kind of, it was a very
Oh,
organic
and I love
process.
what you just said. Idea of working with the people you like, forever.
Mhm.
I think that's always a big driver on
Yeah.
in terms of your overall motivation. your overall performance,
Absolutely.
right? So now in this role, as you just talked about, of course, Chat GPT came in, Gen AI kind of revolutionized the entire industry, how we think. So you look at a lot of different portfolio companies, every day, which come across. So help us understand a bit is Gen AI is everywhere right now. Okay.
Yeah.
What's your take on it? How do you separate, how do you look at products which are truly game changing versus which are just riding the hype wave? And then I also remember you talk about in one of your blogs, time to value being critical for Gen AI
Yeah.
product. So how do you go about, that whole selection process or identifying, and then what should someone look at?
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely, and you're gonna have to stop me at some point here because I can talk about this for a long time. But I guess I'll get started with like what we're seeing and like the sort of stuff that's really interesting to us and the stuff that we kind of stay a little bit away from. Um, I think one of the core truths of what's going on right now is that yes, there's a lot of conversation around Gen AI, and I'm mostly just talking about enterprise adoption within
Yeah.
this kind of full context of what I'm about to say. Um, but enterprises are still really struggling. I mean, there's really basic stuff that hasn't been built out yet, right? One of my favorite examples is, Chevrolet sold a pickup truck for $1, and like there's supposed to be like no takesy backsies, right? Um, there's still a lot of blunders like that are happening, right? And the reasons for that are like the reasons for why that may be happening are numerous, right? There's, you could have had the wrong data. The model may have had a hallucination. You know, something may have gone wrong in the compute layer. Like there would have been a million things. And so I think a lot of the really basic stuff still has yet to be solved. Like RAG LLM is still a very open question, right? And one that some folks treat as like a done deal.
Mhm.
It's still challenging, right? So there's a lot of basic infrastructure that has to be built out. And I think the issue is you kind of come across, I would say, maybe three types of companies, right? Like the first types of companies is like, hey, you're a vertical application for ChatGPT or for, insert LLM here, right? Which I honestly think if you're starting a business, if you want to start a bootstrap business, this is probably the best time to do that because your cost of building something is next to nil, right? And then you have, a huge demand for adoption in some of these industries that people hadn't really thought about before, or that hadn't really thought of, being able to adopt AI are now doing so. You can build a great company with a handful of people and using, an off-the-shelf LLM and have a great life and make a ton of money. That's stuff that we as venture investors, you know, be it sadly or not, have to stay away from because those are not the outcomes that we generally like or generally are looking for as a venture firm. And then there's this really weird second category, which is where I think we spend the most time and like has also been probably the most difficult part of our job. I think there's been more of a focus in the last 48 months than ever on research projects turning into companies, right? And it's primarily to deal with the problems I just mentioned on the enterprise level, right? It's, security control, guardrails, how do you stop hallucination? How do you increase computational efficiency? How do you lower your costs, increase your performance, et cetera? And what we struggle with a lot, and I think a lot of venture investors are also struggling with this, is there's great products that are coming out, right? But not all great products translate into great companies, specifically because there's great research that, can increase performance by, a meaningful margin or decrease cost by a similar margin that sometimes is just better left as research and will become an open source project at some point or another and will be adopted by any of the big players, right? So you have that problem of like you're straddling the line very carefully between, what's going to be open source and what's going to be a research project versus what's going to be a closed source profitable company, right? And then you also have something that I don't think you had previously, which is your incumbents are now moving at the speed of light, right? So you're no longer fighting against, Microsoft, right? You're fighting against OpenAI, Anthropic, etc. These guys that are moving extremely quickly, right? So you also have to think about, hey, if you're going to build infrastructure, you can't let it be a research project, but then you can't also let it be something that these guys are going to go after. So we look for what we call Switzerland infrastructure. So it's basically, what are the companies that are not in that Venn diagram, right?
Okay.
And Martian is a great example, right? Martian builds a model router on top of the foundational models. So they're able to predictively send the prompt or send a request to a specific model, be it internal, be it external, depending on what the output for that prompt should be, right?
That's one of the
Uh,
companies where you talked about strategies for LLM approximation and prompt adaptation,
Wait.
to drive, optimal cost, right?
Yeah, correct. So Martian is a fascinating company. They're basically, if you think about it, they're a little bit like the Google for LLMs, right? So, if you imagine LLMs being links on a web page or on Google, right? And you click on each one to get information, it's very similar, right? So it's kind of, imagine page rank in 2025. That's what Martian is trying to build in terms of like, how do you understand models so deeply? And then you start opening up, kind of the interpretability question, right? But how do you
Mhm.
understand models deeply enough where you can rank them in terms of their performance and their cost for specific prompts, right? So a kind of high level example of this is like, hey, if you want like romantic prose, Claude is better, right, than one of OpenAI's models, right?
Mhm.
But if you want like to know, very specific data on the amount of protein and a scoop of peanut butter, at that point you're better off with OpenAI's model, right? So obviously a very simple example, but like this goes very, very deeply and it gets very complicated when you're running, millions of requests an hour in terms of like, these large enterprise deployments. And
And when
when you
right, so when you're doing that, of course, it can get very expensive with all
right,
the
correct.
so what advice do you have for founders or companies which come which are engaged in trying to balance innovation and keep costs under control? So that's part one. And then what are the pricing models you think are work best for these Gen AI
Yeah.
startups?
So this is actually a place where I think BPOs is like a wonderful business and a wonderful industry. And it's because like you're not gonna get away with selling fluff to a BPO, right? You every dollar counts, right? And like it's every dollar counts because the scale is so massive that if you have a call take 20% longer, on like across the board, you increase essentially your whole cost basis, right? And by 20%. So it's like it is really incredible, like the size of the scale. So I think what's going on is that budgets for AI have also increased considerably within certain enterprises. So, you know, and this is, I think, is starting to mature a little bit more, but like at the start of, this whole AI era, you had massive budgets and people didn't really know what to spend them on because the space was just so new, right? Now, what you're seeing is people are starting to discern a little bit more around, what is hype and where do you actually like, how do you actually calculate time to value, right? And as a BPO, when you're, working on, very specific margins, as a founder, you're going to get, you're going to get torn to pieces if you're trying to, if you're selling something that doesn't provide time to value. And that's actually great. That's actually a wonderful thing. We have an amazing BPO network, and we tell our founders, like, go speak to them, right? Go speak to BPOs because they will tell you immediately what their customers for large enterprises, what do they want and what actually works in deployment and how do you prove value, right? And like, you'll get that information very, very quickly. So I would say just because someone buys something doesn't mean there's a great business case to it, right?
Mhm.
Um, real ROI is what's going to be a larger determinant of your success than if someone signed a DocuSign, right? Um, so let's see, just focus on that. I honestly find so many folks getting trapped into what they think they should be building versus just actually providing value for. And this is, of course, this is like enterprise SaaS because it's just providing value for their enterprise customers, right? Um, and one of the things that I think is wonderful about what's going on is that a lot of these enterprise CXOs are more willing than ever to have deep and insightful conversations around what they think, they should be seeing in their business, right? And what they want from founders and what they want from startups and what they're struggling with, right? So I think that openness of conversation hasn't been seen in a long time, probably since the dot-com bubble.
And then that's the connect
Um,
with Carya helps make with these founders and these
yes, correct.
enterprises, to help them bridge that gap. Correct.
Correct. Yeah, look, I think speaking to enterprise and like really getting to the bottom of things is very clear. To give you a practical example, one of the first things that we looked at when we were creating Sonus is I asked my dad for like his old P&L statements, and like their old financial model for the cost. And it was a small 50
Mhm.
seat cost center, right? But like it shows you like, where does the dollar go in and where does the dollar come out, right? And you have levers to pull here, right? So for example, for Martian, it's very, very easy. They can pull, the cost lever down. Great, cost goes down. Or they can increase the performance level. At that point, your top line should go up. So in terms of pricing models, and I know that was a question you had, is, we see a lot of like subscription pricing, right? For like the base, kind of call it access for the platform. And then there's, of course, usage pricing based on like on top of that. I would say, subscription pricing, there's a bunch of stuff you can do there, but like if you're looking at um your usage pricing and you can't clearly articulate how this is going to save you 2 or 3 times what the usage pricing costs you per unit, like you're going to have a bad time, right? So we see a lot of that. And then, outcome-based pricing has become a lot more common than it used to, right? Specifically in the CX world with anything with automation, right? We have a great business we invested in the summer called Domu, and they automate collections. And that's a beautiful business model, right? Because you're taking money that the enterprise had deemed as lost, and then you're bringing it back. So it's like, hey, yeah, I'll bring you, an extra dollar, but then I'll keep a percentage of it, right? Which is, a way of having um, outcome-based pricing. So it is changing a little.
No, that's great. I'm just being mindful of the time.
Oh yeah.
So one last question. So as you look ahead, what are the trends, in AI or deep tech that you're really getting excited about right now? Some things, which today feel like science fiction, but could actually
Yeah.
happen soon. So,
Yeah. Um, I maybe less like science fiction, but just stuff that like if it was out there when we were building Saunas, or like then the early days of building Saunas, it was like just it's so useful, right? I think there's a couple things. One of them is model distillation, right? And just the ability to distill some of these large language models in a more efficient way just helps with everything, specifically cost related, right? Um, that part is incredibly exciting. There's a lot of companies that are going after it. It's funny because there's I think two schools of thought with that problem. There's the school of thought of like, hey, you immediately need to raise $100 million to even have a crack at this, and then there's like, hey, there's a lot of research. Let's actually just go and continue building this. So, I think there's kind of a new wave of model distillation companies that are going to come out. And then following, I think hybrid ML is also very interesting. So how do you run? And this is like, I'm more interested in that for the inference layer than it is like than for training. But how do you start thinking about like, hey, like at what point do you run on CPU versus, also versus GPU, right? And then what point do you run on clouds, right? So have 3, maybe even 4 nodes where you can run. How do you make that as efficient as possible? And then the third one actually is there's a lot to do with compute verification, right? So right now the silicon layer, similar to LLMs, and like interpretability is of course like a massive thing, but I think everyone's working on that. It's like, hey, how do you go from an LLM being, a 3D printed house to a Lego house that you can kind of take apart? Martian is obviously working on that considerably. Um, on the verification side, there's some super exciting companies working on the verification problem. And it's interesting because that's one of those where we know that that's going to happen, whether it's a startup that takes the whole pie or whether it's, one of the hyperscaler that starts to develop this in-house, like Apple has recently done a lot of work in-house on this issue. Those are really exciting stuff. Like those are really exciting problems to solve. They're not maybe a science fiction-y, right? Um,
No, but they lead to
but
that. There's a step
but they
forward to,
lead to that, right? They're the tools to build,
like you were talking about.
the Star Trek translator.
Standards.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So yeah.
No, this has been great. So any parting thoughts, for our aspiring founders who are listening, what will be the one piece of advice, that you would give them?
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, the first thing is just make sure ideas change a lot, but teams shouldn't, right? At least founding teams shouldn't. So the first thing is make sure you're working with the right people. I think one of the things that I was most lucky with was that I found the right people extremely early in my career, right? So I think that's a very important point. But in terms of like more practical advice is talk to customers as much as you can. And I don't mean like hop on demo calls. I mean, get on a plane and go meet your customers and spend time in their offices, in their, if it's a call center, in their call centers and on their sites, and just truly understand what's going on, right? I see too many people trying to build crazy companies out of the comfort of their desk, right? You just get out there. You truly just get out there. Go speak to your customers, learn about the stuff that someone tells you in a Zoom call is probably 20% of what their real problem is and what they're trying to solve, right? So yeah, I think that's something that is probably my
Great. That's
number one
great
piece of
advice.
advice. Yeah.
That's absolutely great advice. Actually see the problem in action.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
to
100%.
come with the right solutions. No, so this has
100%.
been great. Andres, this has been awesome. Thank you for joining us today. And people can reach out to Carya Venture Partners, on their website, or they can follow you on LinkedIn, in case they want to pitch something to you. So
Absolutely. No, super happy. But Abhi, thank you so much for having me. This was awesome. So excited to
great.
continue working together. And yeah, if anyone wants to reach out, my email is andres@carya.com. So ANDRES at Carya, CARYA .com. So thanks again, Abhi.
Okay, thanks.